we'll see what happens. But healthcare is coming along well. Government is coming along really well.
President Trump giving an upbeat assessment of the latest Republican plan to repeal and replace Obamacare tomorrow, day 100. Dr. Jeff Engel, director of the Center for Presidential History at SMU. Is 100 days a big deal, or as he said a few days ago, an artificial deadline manufactured by the phony news media?
Well, it's both. I mean, historically, we look back at the 100 days of Franklin Roosevelt when he pushed through amazing legislation, really recreating creating the New Deal, and every president since has been held up to what's really an impossible standard for achievement. But it is an important standard, I think, not so much for achievement, not because we expect legislation in the first 100 days, but because it really sets the tone for the administration, especially when we have somebody like Donald Trump who has no elected experience beforehand. Right. This gives him a sense and us a sense of what he's going to be like as president.
Because in the first 100 days, the president presumably had, fresh off the election and the inauguration, should have the warm, fuzzy feeling and the American people behind him. If you believe the polls, and Donald Trump supporters do not, if you believe the polls, he's not the most popular president. Does he have the clout to get what he wants through Congress?
Actually, in fact, it's worse than that, because he is historically the least popular president in the 20th century at this point in his presidency.
And yet he has majorities in both houses of Congress. This, you'd think, would be a slam dunk.
You would think. I mean, again, going back through history, if we look at presidents who come in with popular vote and also both houses of Congress, we look at Woodrow Wilson in 1912, we look at Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, we look at Lyndon Johnson in 1964. In each of those cases, the first period, 6 months or so, is when the mass of legislation gets through. It's when you have essentially the honeymoon period for an administration. It's when everybody's singing from the same song sheet, you have a popular mandate, and if you're going to get things done, this is what Lyndon Johnson always used to say, if you're going to get things done in an administration, the first half of the first part of the first term is when things must be done.
Right.
Because you're never going to be more popular than now.
Right, because after that you're running for re-election. Okay, so let's talk about what he promised in his contract with the American voter, a 100-day contract with the American voter. Congressional term limits, that's not something a president imposes. A hiring freeze, he did.
Yes.
And later eased it. For every one new regulation, 2 would be eliminated. That's been done?
That's been done.
Okay, that kept that one. Identify foreign trading abuses. Obviously, that's in process as well.
Well, and I think one of the really fascinating things about what Donald Trump has done thus far is that so much of it has been done through executive action. Right. And of course, that was a critique for conservatives and Trump of the Obama administration. But frankly, what I think this tells us in a broader sense is that there is such gridlock in Washington, even with both houses of Congress being held by Republicans, that the only way for a president to move the ball forward is with his own pen. So the president has actually now signed more executive actions than any president since Harry Truman in the same period. But I have to make one caveat there. Not all executive actions are the same. I mean, when we say executive action, we are counting both a travel ban, we are counting both a repeal of changing government, and we're also counting, let's celebrate National History Day, let's celebrate National Veterans Day.
Those include executive orders, okay. The president seems to have been a little surprised by a couple of things. First of all, that courts can stop him from doing things. And secondly, that repealing Obamacare is a lot more complicated than anybody knew.
Well, and I think this is one that's really going to come back to bite him, the second one, because that was so much the mantra of all Republican candidates up and down the slate, was that we're going to repeal and replace Obamacare in the first 100 days. The House in particular voted dozens of times under Paul Ryan to repeal Obamacare.
But not replace.
But not to replace, but then on the first day there was no plan. And this is something I think that's going to come back to haunt the president, that essentially his first major legislative action with both majorities did not work.
And in fairness to the president, you'd think that the members of Congress, who've in some cases been there for 20 or 25 or 30 years and for the last 7 or 8 years have been working to repeal Obamacare, would have a plan. You don't expect the president to walk in on day one with a replacement plan.
You would think, and the real problem for President Trump, I think, is that the opposition to the plan came from within his own party. And I think we really need to take a step back and remember that Donald Trump ran not only as a Republican, but in many ways ran against the Republican establishment. So therefore, even though people who are Republicans voted for him, if you're in Congress and you're from a different part of the party, you don't necessarily feel any allegiance to Donald Trump. In many ways, he ran and against you as, as an entity. And now he is historically unpopular with the general electorate. That's traditionally not a recipe for getting your own party on board with your agenda.
And the Democrats are equally in disarray. They are in the minority, but they just don't seem to have a single voice or a single leader.
At this point, I think they're stepping back in many ways and saying, this president is unpopular, this president is having trouble with his own party. Let's, as Tip O'Neill said in 1982 with Ronald Reagan, let's give him the rope to hang himself, essentially.
All right, Dr. Jeff Engel, thanks very much.
Good to see you.